Good afternoon and welcome to today's webcast, World Mental Health Day 2022 workshop, Mental Health in an Unequal World. We are delighted to be working with the Bank Workers Charity to deliver today's workshop led by Paul Barrett, Head of Wellbeing. Please note that we are recording today's session and it will be available to watch on demand afterwards. If you have any questions throughout the workshop, please feel free to submit these via the Q&A box. We hope you enjoy today's session and I will now hand you over to Paul.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Heather. Yeah, hi there. I'm Paul Barrett. I'm the Head of Wellbeing for the Bank Workers Charity. If you can just bear with me a second, I'll share the screen for the session and we can make a start. Lovely. Yeah, I'm Paul Barrett, Head of Wellbeing for the Bank Workers Charity. By profession, I'm an occupational psychologist, and I spend an awful lot of my time looking at reading research about the well-being of employees, the different things that affect it. And of course, financial concerns are one of the biggest factors that affect our well-being. Now, I work for the Bank Workers Charity, and financial well-being has always been a massive thing for us because we see the impact of people's money problems literally on a daily basis through the work that we do with bank employees that we're supporting. And every year, for many years now, we've been spending $1 million and more of our reserves helping bank employees that have got into one form of difficulty and another. Now, it was clear to us, even before COVID, that many employees were having financial difficulties. Of course, COVID then, for many, made it much worse, often because bank employees had partners that were on furlough or had even lost their jobs. And of course, the cost of living crisis has hit since then, and that's taken it a stage further. And that's where we are today, really. We're seeing literally, again, on an almost daily basis, television and news programs showing people who are exposed to awful problems that the cost of living crisis is causing. People, families huddled around in a single room because that's the only house room that they can afford to heat. And that's why we're looking at financial well-being today, because it's never been more important. It has a massive impact on mental health. And I want to explore some of that, the things that affect our financial well-being, but also the support that's available out there. Now, before we do that, I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to put to you. And the first one is a simple one. It's how worried do you feel about your finances over the next 6 months? So are you not worried? Are you quite worried? Or are you very worried? We'll just give a couple of seconds for people to have a play with that, because I'm just interested to see, how widespread money worries are within this smaller community that we're in today, see how reflective it is of the national position. So we'll just give people a moment or two to make their choices. Yeah, well, I mean, you can probably see all of that in front of you as I can. So there is a majority of people who are either very worried or quite worried. And that's, it's pretty reflective of society as a whole at the moment. But it's certainly also true, you might be surprised to hear, of the employee community. And I will be digging a little deeper into that in a moment. So we could close that one down. And I've got a second question for you before we kick off, which is, do you think it's harder to seek help with money problems for people than it is with other life difficulties? There's a lot of attention, for example, paid to mental health problems. So do we think that it's especially hard for people to step forward and acknowledge they're struggling with their money and then try and get some support in doing something about it? Interesting to see what the outcome of that is too, because this also is something that we'll be exploring in a little bit more detail. Yeah, now it's really interesting you should say that, because I have a personal view on this issue, which is I think that organizations and certainly in the banking sector, I know not everybody on the call is probably working for a bank, but certainly in the banking sector, what we've seen is enormous amount of work done within UK banks to address the stigma of mental health in the workplace. And I think had I asked that question maybe 5 years ago, it would have been a very different answer. My personal view is financial well-being has become the biggest stigma in the UK workplace now that we've done so much around mental health. Now, before we kick off into the session proper, if it's okay, I'm conscious there'll be some people on the call, and not just those that are not working in banking, who don't know much about the Bank Workers Charity. So I'm just going to say a little bit about who we are and what we do. I will keep it brief because I know that's not primarily why people are here today. But just a whistle-stop tour for those of you that haven't heard of this before. So essentially, the BWC, the Bank Workers Charity, is a benevolent fund. And our goal is to support the health and well-being of people within the banking community. And that's anybody who has ever worked in banking, actually. It's not just people on this call who may work for banks right now, the current employees. It's anybody, including perhaps somebody who transitioned through banking on their way into a career in something totally different, maybe worked for a high street bank in the 1990s, but now works in engineering and has done for many years. They still have a draw on the charity's resources, as of course do pensioners and retirees. We have a wide range of services. I haven't really got time to go into them in any detail this morning, but they're all free, they're confidential, and they're independent of the banking sector. What I would encourage people to do that don't know so much about this is to visit the website, because there's a snapshot here of some of the common things that we provide support with. We've got services to help people's mental health, counselling around people's personal relationships, around things like bereavement, but loads of practical stuff as well. Help for people who are disabled or have children who have disabilities, support for carers, and an enormous amount around financial well-being. And I will touch on some of that a bit later on. But as I say, I would encourage anybody that doesn't know much about this to visit the website. You'll get a far fuller picture of everything that we can do to support you if you do work for a UK bank. And it's explained in much more detail than I can go into today. But if you're somebody on the call, and there may be some who don't work for a bank, do be aware that there are lots of professions also have benevolent funds, and that's what we are, a benevolent fund. So, you know, and that's everybody from engineers to chartered accountants to firemen. They all have their own benevolent funds, which are probably, or in all likelihood, doing similar kinds of support right now to what we're doing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick off by looking at what we mean when we talk about good financial well-being. And what you got here is a definition from America's Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And what they say is it is a state of well-being wherein you've got control over day-to-day, month-to-month finances. You have the capacity to absorb a financial shock, that you're on track to meet your financial goals. And importantly, you have the financial freedom to make the choices that allow you to enjoy your life. Now, I really like that definition. And what's important about it to me is it's generalizable. And what do I mean by that? Well, it applies to people, whatever their income level or circumstances. And indeed, to illustrate that, I'd just like to mention an event I went to in 2019, organized by an organization called Salary Finance. They'd done their own research into financial well-being. And what they found was the two income groups that worried the most about money were those earning under £10,000 a year and those earning over 100,000. Now, clearly, that is for very different reasons, but it was a very timely reminder for me that everybody has concerns around financial well-being. Now, I mentioned COVID earlier on, but actually, even before coronavirus struck, there were many people in the UK had reasons for their finances to be quite precarious. And I just want to cover that, almost the prehistory of where we are now, if you don't mind, just for a moment. Now, we've had a set of conditions for some time that have made many people struggle. Firstly, we've had a whole decade and considerably more of slow wage growth. The Resolution Foundation, you may have heard of them, one of the big economic think tanks in the UK, they say that the past decade has seen the slowest wage growth since Napoleonic times. But in that same time frame, the cost of living, even before we got to anywhere near where we are now, had risen very significantly. To put it in perspective, between 2008 and 2015, part of the period they were looking at, wages rose by just 9%. But at the same time, the proverbial basket of life's essentials that you hear all the time when you hear the television news talking about inflation, the basket of life's essentials rose by 28%, more than 3 times the salary growth. Accommodation costs, rents and mortgages in just one single year within that time frame rose by 10% in 2015. Now, there has also been an extended period of easy credit, and that's encouraged many people to get into serious debt. In fact, there are 8.3 million people in the UK who now have problem debt, which is when they're unable to pay off their debt, but they're also unable to keep up with their household bills. Now, there's also been and I'm sure you're aware of this, there's been a very big rise in what's termed insecure employment. And there's an especially large rise in 0 hours contracts. What that's done is it's left many people uncertain about what income they're going to have from month to month, sometimes even week to week. Now, if you put all of that together, with that kind of backdrop, I think it becomes a little easier to understand why so many people have been struggling financially. Now, I would like to give you a little bit more detail on some of this to bring us bang up to date. Now, the first figure that you see here, when I first saw this, I was pretty knocked back. It's from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, another one of the big economic think tanks, who say in 2013, for the first time in the UK, in-work poverty exceeded out-of-work poverty. Now, I suspect most of you, like me, assumed that the greatest number of people who would be in poverty in the UK would be the unemployed. Well, that changed back in 2013 and has not reverted back since. And there was a YouGov survey found that 1 in 3 people who are deemed to be on middle-class incomes couldn't pay an unexpected £500 bill without borrowing. Now, that shocked me because I think it demonstrates just how widespread money problems have become. They're not just affecting the more poorly off in society. Now, we hear a lot these days, especially in government circles, about the need to be more financially resilient. And it's true, but the problem is many people just do not have the resources to be financially resilient. 50% of employees are borrowing on a regular basis to pay day-to-day living costs. Now, the pandemic made things worse for many people. It pushed nearly 700,000 more people in the UK into poverty. And there are now 9.6 million people whose household incomes are 25% or more below the official definition of poverty. Now, the problems became so bad in June 2021 that one study found that a quarter of UK workers said they were thinking of taking a second job to protect their income. 30% of them said that they were selling unwanted belongings to make ends meet. Now, that was during the pandemic, and some of you may be sitting here thinking, if it was all that bad, how come I didn't know more people that were struggling? Well, the answer, of course, is that during the pandemic, financial problems were not evenly distributed. Many higher income families, and especially if they were working from home, they actually saved money during the pandemic. The Bank of England actually saw 12 billion of consumer credit paid off, and that was mostly from people that were a bit more well off, but working from home. The problem is things have got much worse now with the cost of living crisis. Now financial well-being problems are much more evenly distributed across the population. In May this year, 43% of people said they were struggling with energy costs. I saw a further update on that in July, and it got up to 63%. So many households by the October rises were predicted to be in real trouble. The governor of the Bank of England has predicted an apocalyptic rise in food prices. And the Bank Citigroup have predicted that inflation, I think it's around 10% now, but I think for food inflation is 13% now. It's expected to hit 18.6% in January. Now, that's going to mean it would exceed the 1970s peak that inflation saw in the UK of 17.8%, that was caused by the OPEC oil shock. And people, of course, are reacting to this bad news in lots of ways. And you know, some of the things I've encountered recently are things like employees pulling out of their pension scheme because they simply can't afford the contributions, or at least reducing the contribution in order to reduce their outgoings. All in all, there are going to be hard times ahead for lots of people. And certainly it's going to be for at least a year, maybe for 2 years. And when people have money problems, it almost invariably affects their mental health. And that's what I want to look at next. Now, there's a very strong relationship between financial worries and mental ill health. 42% of people that need to seek help with debt get prescribed medication to cope with the stress of it all. And people with money worries, well, they're 5 times more likely to suffer with depression. The Citizens Advice Bureau, in a survey that they conducted, found 74% of respondents said that their financial difficulties were affecting their mental health. More than half were having panic attacks. But the relationship between money worries and mental health actually works in both directions, because if you've got mental health issues, you're 3 times more likely to be in debt. And I think the numbers really do tell the story here. 1 in 4 adults with mental health problems are seriously behind with their bills. So that's pretty conclusive, isn't it? The two-way relationship between money worries and mental health problems is very strong. Now, it's not just, unfortunately, our mental health that can be profoundly affected when we get into financial difficulty. And I just want to touch on a few other areas of our lives that inevitably get affected, or not inevitably, very frequently do. Firstly, money worries. They are the single biggest cause of relationship breakdown. And that's something we've seen frequently at the Bank Workers Charity in our work with employees using our services. On many occasions, we offer relationship counselling alongside the support we're giving them with their financial problems. Lawyers refer to the very first Monday of each new year as divorce day. And that's because the strain of the financial problems over the Christmas and the New Year has caused them to seek help from solicitors. Now, there are wider issues. The CAB found 79% of people with debt were losing sleep with financial concerns. Now, that problem is a little more important than you might imagine, because neuroscience has found that when adults get less than 7 hours sleep on a regular basis over an extended period of time, there are inevitably consequences in terms of health and well-being. Now, if it's not too long, it's likely just to be poor concentration, inability to focus, and maybe the odd opportunistic ailment, maybe cold sores, headaches, backache, that kind of thing. But if they're persistent, then there are links to cardiovascular problems, strokes, and heart attacks, and so on. And of course, 54% of people with money problems experience one form of physical symptom or another. But last but not least, I want to mention social well-being, because of course, people's social well-being is profoundly affected when they have money problems, because they just cannot afford to participate in so many of the activities that we all need to enjoy an enjoyable life. Now, I'd like to read you what I thought was a really sad quote from an employee describing how their financial problems had affected them when they were at work. And what this young woman did was to try and disguise what was really going on in her life, but it had very unfortunate consequences. So what she had to say was this: I wasn't considered to be a team player because I wouldn't join sweepstakes, I wouldn't buy cakes or contribute at birthday parties for presents, I wouldn't go out for drinks. I knew what they were all thinking about me, but I just could not bring myself to explain. Now, that's the stigma around financial problems. You know, we talked about this a little bit earlier, right at the beginning of the session. And just staying with that stigma for a moment, I want to show you what I thought was a wonderful graphic from the debt charity step change. And what you'll see here, it's a breakdown of over 500,000 cases that step change had to deal with. And what it shows is the underlying reasons why people got into financial difficulty. Now, what you'll see if you look closely at this is that an unexpected change in somebody's circumstances can tip someone who'd previously been managing their money perfectly well into serious difficulty. Now, coronavirus clearly falls into that cost category, and of course, so does the cost of living crisis. So as you look at this list of the main causes of debt, you can see that an unexpected turn of events in somebody's life, something that could happen to anybody, things like a divorce, a redundancy, a failed business, or maybe just a serious injury or serious illness. These things account for almost 50% of the cases that step change had to deal with. And I wanted you to see that because too often people make the assumption that those who get into financial difficulty, they do so out of fecklessness or just plain irresponsibility with money. Well, I think you can see from this, you're seeing a very different story here, and these are all real life cases. Now, those negative assumptions I just referred to that many people carry around, they're the reason why there is the stigma that hits anybody that has serious money problems. And as I was saying earlier, I think that that stigma is now the single biggest workplace stigma. It's something that we really do need to think about and to deal with, because it's that stigma that makes it so hard for people to come forward, acknowledge they're struggling, and get the help that they need. And that is something that we see all the time at the Bank Workers Charity when we work with bank employees. The reality is it's hard for almost everybody to acknowledge their financial problems, but for bank employees, it is even more difficult. What? You work for a bank and you've got 10,000 quid's worth of debt. How does that work? That's what bank employees worry about. It's things like that, the perception that other people might have of them, that means that they end up delaying and they don't seek help when they really do need it. So what I want to turn to now, because we're going to return to stigma in a moment, I want to look at some of the kind of steps that people can take that will help to shore up their financial difficulty to get through the difficult time that we're going through. Now, I'm not a financial well-being professional, but there are things here which are the principles of sound money management. There's nothing especially new in them, but sometimes, a bit like our general well-being, it's helpful to remind ourselves from time to time of the kind of things we ought to be doing to look after ourselves, to protect ourselves. Now, the first one kind of goes without saying, I know, but how many of us always do it? If you don't already create a budget, it is worth doing so, because doing so will allow you to create a kind of structure for yourself so that you ensure that you've got enough to live on in the day-to-day, but hopefully you can afford the kind of life-enhancing things that we talked about right at the beginning that are important to you. It will reduce the risk of you slipping into debt, but if you're already in debt, it will help you to get back into a sound financial position. Try and avoid impulse purchasing. Now, the availability of credit cards means that can be quite hard to do because it is so easy to shop, particularly online, without proper consideration of whether what we're purchasing is something A, we can really afford, or B, isn't going to cause us problems further down the line. Try and review regular expenditures on an ongoing basis. You know, are there things you're purchasing which are nice, but, you know, maybe you could do without? You might, for example, decide to bring in a packed lunch on days in the office rather than buying something at the local cafe. Perhaps forego the coffee that you buy regularly on the way in from Pret, or review your subscription for Amazon Prime. Do you really need Netflix, Prime, Disney? You know, the problem with these relatively low-level expenditures, yes, not a huge amount in their own right, but cumulatively they do matter. To try and save to fund future spending, you know, to get into the habit of saving, the easiest way, of course, is to make it automatic by setting up a standing order so that you transfer money from your current bank account into a savings account, easily done, and that allows you to create the kind of safety net that will protect you against some of the financial shocks we saw in the last slide that tip people into financial difficulty. What happens if your boiler breaks? Try and pay down any bad debt. Now, good debt, that's what we have when we purchase something that's going to increase in value over time, you know, something like a mortgage. But according to the Money Advice Service, bad debt is something that drains your wealth, isn't really affordable, and offers no real prospect of paying for itself over time. Credit purchases, they're a typical example of that. They can be a problem because of the high interest rates they often involve. And then finally, if you do get into financial difficulty, try and seek expert help. But as I was suggesting earlier, seek it early. Make use of the advice and guidance that's out there. There's lots come up in recent times, specifically targeting the cost of living crisis. But I want to kick off by looking at what we do at the Bank Workers Charity for those of you that are unfamiliar with it. Firstly, our website has some brilliant tools on there. There's a money health check. There's a budget planner for those of you that are used to building budgets. You know, in the past, you know, many of us possibly didn't make budgets because we knew we had enough to get by on, and we didn't do the calculation. Maybe that's not so true anymore. There's a benefits calculator. Every year, there is 16 billion in unclaimed welfare benefits, and significant amounts of that are actually available to people in work. We saw earlier the number of people who are in work and in poverty. Some of them may well be thinking, I wouldn't get anything. Why am I bothering applying? I've got a job. Financial grants, I've touched on this already. Depending on people's circumstances, we do spend the charity's money helping people who have got into financial difficulty of one kind or another. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples now of just some cases where we've done that, because I think it will give you a sense of how we work and the kind of instances where we have stepped in. Now, the first one is a female bank employee who was in a pretty awful position. It was during the pandemic lockdown, and she was in an abusive relationship with her partner. And she found that during the pandemic, with the lockdowns, the abuse got much worse. And that's a common trend. They referred to domestic abuse, you're probably aware, as the parallel pandemic during COVID. It got so bad that she ended up having to flee the family home. And effectively, she was starting off from scratch. She didn't have the wherewithal to start a home again. So she approached BWC, and we funded the purchase of things like furniture, bedding, crockery, all of the things that she had to leave behind her in her home when she left, so that she was able to start up again. Now, incidentally, we did also provide her with counselling to help her to come to terms with the breakup of the marriage and also the extremely distressing experiences that she'd been through. And that's typical of the way that we work. We don't just work on the issue that the person presents with initially. The next one's an example of a 25-year-old young man. Now, he was living at home with his mother. Both of them were in difficulty. She'd been furloughed, but she wasn't getting any money through. This was very early actually in the pandemic. So early that he had just resigned from his job at the bank to take up a really exciting new job that he'd been offered. Problem was, lockdown started and the new company withdrew the job offer. The bank couldn't take him back. He wasn't eligible for furlough, of course, and he had zero income, as did his mother. So the Bank Workers Charity stepped in. we funded both him and his mother until eventually, but it took a long time, the benefits came through and they're able to be self-sufficient again. And then finally, we've got an example of a man whose marriage broke down and he had to leave the family home. He left it to his wife and kids. He moved, meanwhile, into rented accommodation. The problem was he had to continue paying the mortgage, but he was also paying the rental accommodation costs as well. He was really struggling financially almost from the start. He was going round and round in circles, accumulating more and more debt. And worse, he was paying off non-priority debt and he was foregoing food in order to do that. So BW stepped in, we helped him to reprioritize his debt repayments. We helped him to get his finances back in order so that he was managing his money over time in a sustainable way again. But again, because of the broader view we take, we also gave him a grant to purchase beds and to redecorate his property, because one of the problems was with the breakup of the marriage, he was really missing his children and he couldn't have them to stay with him in his accommodation the way things were. So there are a few examples of the way that we work with people. I just want to touch, before we finish, a couple of other organizations that it would be good for you to be aware of. We work very closely with the debt charity Step Change. I used an infographic from them just now. We each do things the other doesn't. They are brilliant at helping people to maximize their money or to manage debt. But unlike us, they have no money to spend. They have no grants to give. So some of the very best support we've been able to provide has been through that combination of our financial resources to help people to get through a crisis and Step Change's expert advice that allows them to solve their financial problems, but to do so in a sustainable way. Like us, they're independent, confidential, and they're free. Yes, they tackle debt, but they also provide good money management advice. And they help people to maximize their income. Now, for those people who are in the banking sector, if you ever wanted to access Step Change services, it would be worth coming with BWC because obviously you get the advantage of our combined effort. But anybody can use Step Change and they are an absolutely excellent charity. And then finally, I'm not going to look at that last slide, but I will just give you a couple of examples of other organizations that are doing brilliant stuff. Money Saving Expert, many of you will know about Money Saving Expert. They have some absolutely brilliant content on their website. It is constantly updated in line with whatever changes are going on at government level around benefit entitlements, different forms of support there are out there. There are some really outstanding resources on that website. There's a fantastic cost of living crisis survival guide. It's full of really good tips for maximizing income, generating income, saving money. And Martin Lewis's cost of living crisis help page also has some brilliant ways of doing all of those things. I've mentioned Step Change already. They're excellent on helping with debt and money management, but they also have some wonderful tools on their website too. So with that, I'm going to conclude. And for anybody that is eligible and wants to access the BWC services, you've got all of the contact details there. If there is anybody on the call who, for whatever reasons, doesn't want to raise a question that they'd like to ask in this public forum, well, my email address is there as well. So do feel free to drop me an email and I'll do anything I can to help. It's been a very hard time the last 6 months, but probably more, probably a year. I'm not being fair on many people that were probably already struggling, but you know, it's been a very hard time. It may well get harder. I sincerely hope it doesn't, but the economic indicators aren't brilliant. So that being the case, there are going to be probably more people than right now who are struggling. And if you do at any stage find yourself in that position, be aware of the kind of resources we've been looking at today, and also make sure to approach us early.
Thank you so much. I hope you've all enjoyed today's session. I'd just like to thank Paul for delivering such an insightful workshop and for all of our participants for being so open today. I hope everyone has a great rest of the day and we look forward to welcoming you at future webcasts. Thank you.